Even little surprises that are nice are always welcome, aren't they? Maybe you had chores that you were going to do and you got to them and found out that somebody had already done them for you. And you had a little extra time and a little extra effort to put out that day. And they're always welcome to have nice surprises. Some people are just mean and bitter, too. They just thrive on being mean and bitter. And they're mean because they are bitter. And it becomes their nature. They may not start out life that way, but because of circumstances and events that they've lived for, they just become bitter. And there's nothing more sour than a bitter old person. I don't like bitter young people either, but old people that get bitter are just hard to live with. You can't do enough for them, and you can't do anything right. Well, does it matter how you treat people? Especially the mean and bitter people. People that mistreat you. Do you ever just think to yourself, I'd just like to teach them a lesson? We'll see if they like it, what they did to you. And how about this? I don't get mad, I get what? Even. And so you become just like the bitter, mean person. You become like the person that you react to that you don't like in the first place, and mean and bitter. And so, does it matter how we treat that person? Do they just get what's coming to them? And do we delight to see it? I'm going to read a verse in 3 John chapter 5. 4 verses here. Dear friend, you are showing your faith by whatever you do for the brothers. And this you are doing for strangers. They have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, since they set out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from pagans. Therefore, we ought to support such men so that we can be co-workers with the truth. Jesus said that we would be judged for every what? Idle word, remember that? What we say makes a difference. Thank goodness I'm not real witty, because after I've dealt with somebody that has mistreated or been mean in some way, it's about 5 minutes after I left their presence that I think of what I could have said. And if I was witty, I probably would have said. But since I don't come up with things that quick, it's probably a good thing to be a little slow. John said in 2 John chapter, well, there's just one chapter, he says, I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth, in keeping with a command we have received from the Father. And in 3 John verse 4, he says, I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Now in 3 John, after the verses that I just read for our text, there is a story about Diotrephes. Everybody that's been in church for a small period of time knows who Diotrephes is. And he is front and center at a whole lot of churches. His number one characteristic is he loves to have the preeminence. He loves to be up front and in front of people. Even maybe celebrate. I knew a man one time that whenever the church was full, maybe it was a revival or some kind of event, and the church was full and there were a lot of people there that weren't regular attenders, he wasn't a preacher, but he would always be up and about in the church building. He would get up from the front pew. He didn't sit in the very front pew, about 2 or 3 back. And he would puff out his chest, and he would walk down the aisle. I don't know what he did. There was nothing evident that he did. The thermostat was on the other end of the church by the pianist, and that was a different story. We always had to go by her regulations on the thermostat. But anyway, he would get up and walk down the aisle, walk back, sit down. A few minutes later, he'd get up and saunter around somewhere. He wasn't shaking hands. He was just being seen. And the message was, I'm in control around here. And he was. And he was in control. And so everybody knew it. Well, Diotrephes not only loved to have the preeminence, he beat down everybody else that might rise up in some function a little bit and try to do something that he wanted to control. That's Diotrephes. And when the church wanted to welcome people, he would discourage it. I know what he did. It's not in the Bible, but I know what he did. He just found a lot of reasons why that wouldn't work around here. And he wanted to be in control. God deliver us from people that want to be in control and in charge. A lot of those people, if you'll notice, a lot of the Diotrephes are mean and bitter if they don't get their way. They love to get their way. And they will fight subtly. Maybe not come out and make a big party against the church, although some do that. They will talk privately, get people on their side, and then they'll make their move and divide the church. That happens way too often. But others have other subtle ways to get their way. They connive and scheme until nothing happens, until they get their way. And they hide it by saying things need to be perfect. It's not good enough for God. But when you say things need to be perfect, what you mean is according to your standard. They have to be. That's just another way of saying, I want my way. And it happens all the time in churches because it's the nature of people. And we have a sinful nature. And it's our nature to want things our way. And nowadays, people have become so sensitive that they'll leave the church if they don't get their way. They'll just go find another place where they can get their way, and it's easy to do because all churches are like ours. They're hungry for people. And when a visitor goes to a new church, oh, come on, join here, be a part of us. And so it doesn't really matter how they left one church, because they can go to a new church and get their way for a while. But it divides the kingdom. I want you to look, dear friend, you are showing your faith by whatever you do for the brothers. Your job is not to get your way. Your job is to promote the brothers. Now in 1 John, John uses brothers sometimes as not just Christian brothers, but as fellow humanity. And that's probably the way that he's using it here. But I'm going to use it as I see the passage unfolding. Whatever you do for the brothers, this you are doing for, and this you are doing for strangers. He's complimenting them. Helping other people succeed. Other people's ideas that we may not even always agree with, but they're not sin. And helping them. You are showing your faith by whatever you do for the brothers, and this you are doing for strangers. Who are the strangers? Are they just people that we meet on the street that we've never met before? I think they're people that come into the church. Because the church is made up of people from all walks of life, all different kinds of backgrounds, people that we would never be friends with on the job or in school or somewhere else. And they come to the church. And there's one of two choices. You can either benefit them and welcome them, or you can divide up into little groups within the church. And you'll have this party over here, and you'll have this party over here. The poor people, rich and famous in one group, the people from the ghetto in another group, and see the differences in people. Those are the strangers. Those are people that we don't know outside of the church, but they're brothers. And you will show your faith by whatever you do for the brothers. Now, in a small church, we get to know one another rather quickly. But in the church at Corinth, if you will remember, they were dividing up in factions over their favorite preacher. And they were divisive in their body. The rich people would come to the Lord's Supper, and they would bring their fancy foods, and they would all eat together in a huddle. And the poor people would be left out. They didn't have much to bring, and they were hungry, and others were gluttons. And the church was divided. And Paul says the church divided like that ought not to eat the Lord's Supper together. You have to be one body from one loaf to enjoy the fellowship of the Lord's Supper. And I know that poor people sometimes are intimidated by the rich or the famous. And rich people sometimes feel uncomfortable among the poor because they don't want to have to go down a notch from their high status. And people from different social groups or vocations can sometimes gather together because they've got something to talk about. And so they divide up into circles. A lot of ways to divide a church. But you are showing your faith by what you do for the brothers and even for the strangers. Everybody enjoys a nice surprise. It's always welcome. Sometimes, I know Baptist women has chosen names or something, and they are secret, and they just do nice things throughout the years for that purpose. Shouldn't we all be doing that all the time? Looking for things that we can do to build even the people we don't know well, the strangers. And for the brothers that we do know well, so that nobody is left out. And that's what John is saying. Now he goes on. This they were doing. They have testified to your love before the church. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? if the whole town was talking about how the church people loved one another? Isn't that what they said in Acts about the disciples? See how they, no, it was Tertullian that told us this in the 2nd century. Oh, well, Tertullian was in the 3rd century. And the people in the community that didn't like the Christians, and Christianity was not legal in the Roman Empire at that time, but the community was all saying the same thing. See how they love one another. What a testimony. And that's what he calls it. They have testified to your love before the church. Oh, if God's people could only love one another. And somebody asked him one day, John, why do you keep saying the same thing, love one another? And he said, because it's enough if they will just love one another. What an evidence of Christianity. To love people that aren't like us. To love people on a different side of town. To just love people and do for them all the time. And to love one another. You know how much doctrine it solves and teaches when people love one another? Everything you need to know about God is summed up in that. For God is love. What a testimony. What a preaching of God and who He is when His people love one another. And I'm not talking about something you feel in your heart. There's a love that we call love that's in our heart for people that we're especially near to. But can we not grow that love in our heart for people that we don't even know, the strangers that are in our church? And to just love them with everything we have. And if we know they have a need, we try to solve it so that it doesn't burden them. In fact, Paul said in Galatians, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Just doing for people. Look around you. Look at people. You know who they are in our small community. You know who they are, and you pretty much know their needs. Love one another. Figure out something nice to do for them. But there's more. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, since they set out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from pagans. Some of these strangers were missionaries. They were itinerants. Some were evangelists. And I don't mean evangelists in the sense that we use it today. I mean people who just traveled about as an itinerant speaker, speaking for the Lord. And he said, they have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. In this good church, some strangers had come into the fellowship that were itinerants. And they had dwelt there a while, and they saw the testimony of how the people loved one another, and they reported it everywhere they went. And they told of the sacrifices the people made for one another. You would do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. How often do you pray for missionaries? How much of your time is invested and your money invested in missions? People that go around the world testifying of the churches that love God so much that they pool their funds and they send us here. When Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch, they were sought and found for one purpose, and that was to be missionaries. and the Antioch church all got together, and the people were united enough, Jews and Gentiles, that they supported Paul and Barnabas to go to the Gentiles and preach the gospel. And so they went into Asia Minor and all the cities there, and they came back. And they gave a report, and the church sent them again. And they went even farther into Europe. And they came back, and they sent them again on a third missionary journey. And Paul wrote the letter to the church at Rome and said, I have so often wanted to come to you, but Satan has hindered me, but I am coming. First of all, I've got to take this offering from the Gentiles to the Jerusalem church. And I'm going to give it to them, and that will help unite Jew and Gentile together. And when I come back, I want you to be the church that sends me to Spain. And it wasn't an obligation, and it wasn't a sore spot. It was a privilege to spread the gospel around the world. It was a joy. And that's what John meant when he said, I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Walking in the truth. It doesn't matter how much you do in this world. The one thing that is a priority that God will honor, and that is sending out people to preach to the world. To defend and stand up for the truth of this book. That's the whole thing. That's all that matters in your life. You will not be judged for how much money you made in this life, or what kind of a car you drive, or what kind of a house you live in, or even for who your friends are. But you will be judged for the way you walked in the truth. Is your priority spreading the Word of God? One other thing, verse 8. Therefore, we ought to support such men so that we can be co-workers with the truth. Letourneau went into business. He said, I'm going to give my business to God. And whatever I make, I'm going to give to the ministry. And God blessed his work, and he literally moved mountains. His bulldozer. God so blessed his ministry that with his bulldozer, he literally moved mountains. If you read his biography, R.G. Letourneau. He dedicated his business to God, and what he made, he started giving. And he gave to Christian ministries, and he gave more, and God blessed and honored his business, and he gave, and he gave, and he gave, become a very wealthy man, and gave away millions. And God honored him for his faithfulness. And so we support the church, its missions, by walking in the truth and loving one another and loving our fellow brothers that are doing the work of the ministry. I'm going to ask you this week to make a commitment to blessing the brothers. I want our church to be bound so tight together and love one another that everybody in the church is on our mind every day of the week. And we're thinking, how could I make their life easier? How could I make their life better? What could I do for others? Heavenly Father, may that be our commitment, to walk in the truth and to show it by loving one another. And help us, Lord, to be full of love. By the generosity of our brothers and sisters in Christ, May whatever meanness and bitterness is in our soul be rid. And help us, Lord, to love one another because you have loved us. And we just pass on the blessings that you have given to us. Amen.